Good morning, everyone, and thanks first of all for having me here. So my name is Marcus Thor, I'm the CEO of Hexicon, and today I'll give an insight into, well, first of all, what floating offshore wind is, where that industry is, and what we do at Hexicon to take part in a really swiftly accelerating industry that is just now on the verge of commercialization. So I'll briefly go through what floating offshore wind is, Hexicon in brief, and then our two legs of our business model, which is product development and technology. So first of all, to make the case for floating offshore wind, and perhaps, before that even starting with saying what floating offshore wind is. And it might be intuitive, but it's really hard to visualize, I think, if you haven't seen it. So it's literally placing the tower and the wind turbine, traditional wind turbines, on a floating foundation. So it floats, it's moored to the seabed with mooring lines and anchors just like a sailboat, but they're obviously somewhat larger and multiple of them. And why is this even something we're doing? Why not place them on land or on the shallow waters down on the seabed? Well, the simple reason is that the demand is greater than the available suitable areas, that's both onshore and shallow water. From a global perspective, over 80% of waters in territorial areas suitable for offshore wind are deep. There is a big area in the southern North Sea with a lot of shallow water. That's where offshore wind has mainly been built out. That luxury of large shallow water areas are not available on a global scale. So there is a big demand to meet renewable requirements and targets around the world. This industry right now is on the verge of commercialization. It's been tested for some 13, 14 years in various types. The first full-scale turbine on a floating foundation was installed in 2009. Since then, there's been around 20 installed. That is, however, to be compared with bottom-fixed offshore wind, traditionally placed mounted down on the seabed, where there are over 10,000 turbines installed. So there's a really big difference in maturity here, but there's many gigawatt projects planned that will be built and installed during the second half of this decade. So it's coming quickly. A few of the key reasons, one is availability of sea. So this resource is virtually unlimited when you go out to deep waters. The flexibility is a lot greater, so you can easier avoid conflicts with other stakeholders. You can get out of sight. You don't need to see turbines offshore from the coastline. And wind speeds are not only higher in average, but they're also more stable. All in all, achieving higher capacity factors when you go further off the coast. And I wanted to give a feel for what's going on in the world right now. A few notable events starting over in the US, where since Biden took office, there's been a ramp up in offshore wind ambitions. And in fact, just before Christmas, they held their first ever deep water auction. So central government, BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in the US, dictated a few areas, in this case 5 areas on the west coast, offshore California and Oregon. Here it's suitable for floating offshore wind. It's really deep waters, upwards to 1,000 meters. Come in, all developers from around the world, place your bids, how much is the seabed worth? And it's an auction process, and that ended with 5 developers, mainly from Europe, that achieved seabed rights in the US. So they have specific targets for floating offshore wind, not only offshore wind. Over here in Europe is where it's predominantly led, not only offshore wind, but also floating offshore wind, where we've had multiple auction rounds in various countries, such as the UK. New markets down in the Mediterranean, there's several of them opening up. Greece is one of them, Portugal is one of them, Spain is now also considering and looking at mapping out seabed. All these areas are deep waters. And we're also seeing a few new markets. Norway, probably end of this year, will have auctions that include deep water areas, as well as Ireland. So there's a lot going on in both US and Europe, and not the least over in Asia, is where I probably think that we'll see the first large-scale, commercial-scale offshore wind farms using floating technology, probably in South Korea, if I were to bet. So what do we do at Hexicon? We do two things. We're a project developer and we're a technology provider. And I'll come back to show what our proprietary technology looks like. In project developments, it's a fairly typical project development business model where we engage from the outset, find the right markets, the right area within the market, package that, design and develop that area for it to be ultimately investable. So we hang on with ownerships in projects, increase the value of such projects to then sell down at certain timings, at certain milestones. On the technology side, it's linked to using our IP, our patented technology, which I'll show in just a slide. And that's a license fee model. So for every unit that is used of our technology, we get a license fee of a few % of whatever that build cost is. And this, doing both in the same company is fairly unique in this space. So there's a lot of project developers out there, very big ones, and they are pretty much all technology agnostic. So they don't want to pick a technology, they don't want to have a technology themselves, they want to remain technology neutral for as long as possible in project developments and prefer to stay out of the ownership of technology. Then you've got a lot of technology providers. There's probably 70 plus different alternatives with patent pendings or IP in place of how to place turbines on floating foundations. Where we are disruptive is that we're placing 2 turbines on the same foundation, and I'll come back to why. So there's plenty of competition, but doing both in the same company, there's not that many that do. And we see the synergies across these two. Not only the obvious that project developments entails opportunities to use the technology, but vice versa as well. So we're using the fact of having IP to open markets and partnerships. And in fact, we wouldn't be in a lot of the markets we're in if we couldn't come also with the IP that we are sharing with local partners for selected markets. So we're using them between each other, and they really enforce each other commercially. Where is Hexicon right now? Well, we've spent a few years mainly investing in mostly the project portfolio to get it to a size where it is today, where it's wide enough and diversified enough in markets and in maturity grades to now also look at start divesting certain portions of it. So as of this year, we will now start to see divestment take shape, and as such recycle capital to come back into the business and further grow the portfolio. So as shown here on the bottom of this figure, we've split our journey in 3 stages. The first one to mainly invest, to grow. A second where we're not stopping investing, but we're also recycling capital through divestments of projects. And then the last and final stage, where we do all them still, but we also have a proven technology, so we can have that used and also gain license fees. So the product development part is a revenue that is shorter term, that can create a profitable company, but the truly scalable part of the journey is when the technology is also verified. And in project developments, this is really what it's about. I'm not going to spend too long here. As time goes on and as you've invested and put work in place to achieve milestones, you increase the value of projects, and it's during the development phase, so between starting and before starting construction, that's where Hexicon operates. So we've focused on the earlier parts of the whole life cycle of a project. This is where our core skill set is, and this is where it's not so capital intense. It's a really capital intense industry, but it goes from being, tens up to $100 million during development phase to billions of dollars during construction. So that's a game where Hexicon during construction is not able to take part of. And the value increase, I should say as well, is mainly linked to permitting, which is very much a local discipline. So the partnerships around the world is key in our growth. Those permits are typically linked to seabed rights, and then permits to environmental impact assessments, and then you have grid connections, so the agreement to actually be able to export electricity into the grid, and a few others. And looking at Hexicon's position in this, well, we are one of the few with over a decade of experience of floating wind, in fact. So we're one of the pioneers and early movers in this space. And we do have across the relevant regions, I should say, for floating offshore wind. We've got a presence over in the US, a handful of people, very senior, to take place in that very long-term market. We've got over here in Europe over 13 projects underway in various stages, and we've got a team of 15 in our local JV in South Korea, preparing what could potentially be the first really large-scale project together with Shell. So onto the technology, and I'll let this movie run for you while I speak. So our technology and how it differentiates with a lot of the competition is that it's got 2 turbines on the same foundation. It's a triangular shaped steel structure that floats on its own. It's about 15 meters draft beneath the surface. It's about 15 meters above, and the width and other dimensions are very much dependent on how big the turbines are. So it's fully agnostic to turbines. And beneath this front corner, the corner that doesn't host the turbine, is where the mooring system is attached from beneath, and it's attached to a single point. And that attachment point is through what's called a turret, and that's basically just a big bearing, like one from SKF, but a lot bigger, and it allows this unit to freely rotate with the wind direction. And this is the key of our IP, because if you didn't allow this unit to rotate, these 2 turbines would be too close to each other. One would be downwind of the other in so-called turbulent air, which would cause damages to that downwind turbine. So this is the key of the IP. And why do we do it? And not only because we can, and we've managed to get patents for it, but there's obviously a reason for it. The 2 main design drivers are, one, perhaps the obvious, cost of energy. We're reducing costs by in simple words, 2-for-1 thinking. There's 1 mooring system, 1 cable, there's 1 installation process, etc., for 2 turbines. The other, equally important, is minimizing the impact on surrounding activities. So how do we maximize our coexistence with other marine users? And there's a lot of marine users out there. If you look at, out from the coastline at sea, it looks endless. But when you start layering different interest groups on top of each other, commercial shipping, military, fishing, nature preserved areas, etc., the oceans aren't endless anymore. You want to make sure that you capture as much energy as possible once you've nailed down an area that is suitable and that is not in conflict, and not the least visual impacts. So with 2 turbines on the same foundation, we're able to install up to 40% more turbines in a given sea area compared to single turbine versions. And this is a key here. It's not on top of people's priorities, offshore wind developers today, but it will grow in importance for every year that passes and more turbines are installed out at sea. So a quick look at the project portfolio. We've, through a partnership model, so trying to keep our operations in Hexicon fairly asset light, which in the project developments means that we invite investors fairly early. That allows us to grow a fairly broad project portfolio without significant investments. So we've at the moment got a gross project portfolio of 17 gigawatt, net Hexicon's ownership around 9, across geographies, mainly here in Europe, but also over in Asia, predominantly there in South Korea. And recently, there's been a lot of swift progress in Italy. Stands out over the last quarter at least, where we've managed to secure not only water rights to over 2 gigawatts of projects, but also grid capacity secured for over 7 gigawatt. So this is a market that is really coming quickly, and it's a market that's got clear ambitions. It's got only deep waters. There's no real alternative in Italy. It's got external and foreign dependence, gas, etc., and really wants to drive its renewable agenda. It's also one of the big recipients of the EU Green Deal. Over in Sweden, we're working together with Mainstream Renewable Power, which is formerly Aker Offshore Wind, that is part of the big Aker group, one of Norway's biggest employers. So we teamed up with them for the Swedish market due to their industrial heritage. Here we're developing sites in both the east and the west coast of southern Sweden. I'll come back to a map showing that. Where we've got first permit application into the government in just a few weeks. All our projects are with floating wind technology. again, meaning that we can place them further off the coast where they're not visible from shore. It also means that the application goes into the government, and we're outside the 12 nautical mile, the territorial border, which means that we're outside the municipality veto. In South Korea, it was one of our first projects. We've been there since 2018. I've lived there myself for a year with family to get that started. And in spring 19, oil major Shell bought into this project, so they now own 80% of this project, and we hold the remaining 20%. And this is on path, full speed ahead, to start construction middle of this decade, 2025, late, with a target to be the first gigawatt plus commercial scale floating offshore wind farm in the world. And lastly, I want to mention in England as well, which is our technology project. So our patented technology has not been installed in full scale yet. We've done everything you can except there in terms of numerical assessments, multiple model testing in laboratories. This will be the first project using it in real scale. So there, it's on track to start construction end this year, early next. It will be 2 units, 4 turbines, 8 megawatt each. And just a quick one on Sweden. Here's a look at 3 of our sites, 2 on the east coast and 1 on the west coast. The one on the west coast, Mareld, is where the first permit application will go in. And what I want to just illustrate with this picture that doesn't show any turbines, that is the purpose. So this is an actual rendering that goes as part of the application to the government that visualizes using the largest possible turbines at this future installation date that we can ever intend to use for the project. This is what it would look like from shore. So the point here, which I think is really important in a lot of markets, but not the least Sweden, is that with floating foundations and floating technology, you've got that added flexibility. You don't need to be in shallow water. You're not constrained by close coastal areas. So you can push them further offshore and out of sight. And the obvious question to that is, okay, isn't that a lot more expensive? The fact of the matter is no. So the increase in cable costs for 10 or so kilometers extra is very marginal. And on top of that, you're out at further off the coast where you've got higher wind speeds and more stable wind speeds. So yes, today, floating offshore wind is more expensive than shallow water bottom fixed. But there's 2 aspects to consider here. One, it's on a really steep decline curve of cost. So in a few years, it's not going to be more expensive. I'm absolutely convinced. And secondly, in a lot of the markets, you don't have an opportunity to install on bottom fixed. And even if you could, there's a likely or a high chance that you won't get permits because you're impacting other activities or you're in sight from the shore. In pretty much all markets across the globe, activity out at sea, whether it's fishing, shipping, or whatever it is, goes down with distance from shore. And as a last slide, just wanted to quickly show to get a feel for sizes as well. This is the size of the turbine from Vestas that our project with Shell over in South Korea will use. So we are in preferred supplier agreement with Vestas. This is their 15 megawatt turbine, V236. So the 236 is the diameter of the rotor area. So these are blades that are 115 meters, so that's longer than a soccer field. And the tip height of the blade's tip at its highest point is 258 meters. So it gives you a perspective of the sizes of this, and turbines are growing like crazy, of course. All the more reasons to push them further off the coast. So this tip height is about 100 meters higher than Kaknästornet. So it's really massive things out there, but that's okay, and it's very much possible with building them near the coast, shipping them out in waters to large areas that are really far offshore. Sizes isn't that big of an issue because we're not disturbing. So I think with that, I'll stop. I'm not sure if this time is correct here. And just maybe wrap it up quickly, with just saying that where are we, Hexicon? Well, we're one of the few with over a decade of experience. And it's really about making sure that we're able to capitalize on this really, really accelerating industry that is now taking commercial shape. So with that, I'll stop, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Marcus. There is a sort of a, well, war raging, not the Ukrainian war, but the war between Europe and the United States when it comes to offering companies and looking at the energy transition. So from that perspective, what we're seeing now, how does this affect Hexicon in terms of giving out, lowering the entry points for companies to invest in different parts, United States, that area, or Europe?
Well, I think in Europe, we've already established and made it work. I think, first of all, regardless of market, you will always, in our industry, need that local competence and local partner. Because a lot of what you need, both from an early value increase perspective of your business, but also ultimately getting the rights to install, it's a local discipline. It's permits, it's with local governments, etc. So you need that local competence regardless of where you are. On top of that, there is definitely an increased barrier to get into a country like the US. It's offshore activities. There's a lot of protectionism rules, both using vessels and other things, how you manufacture and where you manufacture. Energy is very much politically driven. A lot of countries are also enforcing directly or indirectly different local content regimes. So the US is, I would say the US and Japan are one of the two big holy grails. So really big long-term markets, but also where the barrier is a bit higher to get in.
There has been shifts after the IRA.
Sorry,
there's been shifts in policies after the IRA.
Absolutely, but it's still, there's a lot of parts in there that you still need to overcome. Not the least how you install this and where you're going to do it. Because if you take on what you should do, not the least from marine operations, installations offshore, that's not available in the US today from a supply chain perspective. So I don't think you have a chance to meet some of these early targets at least without either changing legislation slightly or increasing and expanding the supply chain and infrastructure, ports and vessels in the US.
So Marcus, looking ahead, let's look at 2030. Percentage-wise, what is your estimate of on your type of technology and the moored, not the moored, but the anchored wind power plants?
Well, if you so not Hexicons then, but if you said floating,
floating,
versus
yes,
fixed bottom, it's still going to be more fixed bottom for sure. And there right now, as I said, over 10,000 turbines are installed. There are only 20 on floating foundations. But new installations, I would think that around 30 or just thereafter, new installations annually, floating will surpass fixed. And then you'll probably take another, 15 or so years before floating takes over. But if we truly want to achieve, just looking at Europe, targets for 2050, 300 gigawatt of offshore wind, not even half of that is possible to install on shallow water, so with fixed bottom technology. So it will come big, but things take time in this industry, unfortunately.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. Best of luck. Thank you.